You're draining it? Sarah, honey, we're in the worst drought this county's seen in a decade, and you're draining the one thing on your property that still has water in it.
Dale Weston stood at the edge of the feed store parking lot, arms crossed, shaking his head like he genuinely couldn't believe what he was hearing. Behind him, two of his plant managers exchanged a look and laughed, quiet but not quiet enough. "That pond's fed your family for 3 generations," Weston said, raising his voice a little for the small crowd gathering near the truck bay. "And you're gonna pull the plug on it because what, you got a bad feeling?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She'd learned in the 2 years since Weston's bottling plant expanded onto the land bordering hers that giving this man a reaction was the same as handing him a gift. "Somebody ought to check on that girl," Weston said, not quite under his breath, grinning at his managers. "Draining her own water in a drought, that's not stubborn, that's just sad." More laughter. Sarah picked up her feed order and walked to her truck without a word. She didn't tell him what she'd actually watched that pond do over the past 6 weeks, dropping nearly a foot faster than any drought or evaporation could explain, even in the worst heat this county had ever logged. Weston didn't know what she was about to find at the bottom of that pond. Nobody in that parking lot did. They were about to find out, and when they did, it was going to cost Dale Weston the one thing he thought no drought could ever touch: his entire bottling operation. Now, to understand why a woman would drain her own family's water source in the middle of a historic drought, and why Dale Weston laughing about it in that parking lot was about to become the worst mistake of his career, we have to go back 6 weeks, to the first morning Sarah noticed her pond had dropped almost a foot overnight. If you felt your blood boil watching a grown man mock a woman for something she clearly understood better than he did, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city, what country you're watching this from. I want to see how far this thing reaches before it's over, because the American farmer exists for exactly this moment. Stay with us, because what Sarah found at the bottom of that pond, I promise you, was worth every second of what you just watched. Here's what you need to know. Sarah Voss was 33 years old, running 40 acres alone since her father passed 2 years back. 40 acres built entirely around a spring-fed pond that had supplied irrigation and drinking water for 3 generations of her family, long before anyone in the county had ever heard of Dale Weston or his bottling company. Weston's operation sat on the property line, expanded 18 months back under an old agricultural use groundwater permit. A permit that, on paper, limited his draw to a modest amount for crop irrigation on his own land. And here's what nobody understood, not even Sarah at first. 6 weeks earlier, walking the edge of her pond one morning, she noticed the water line had dropped nearly a foot overnight, far more than the historic drought and record heat could explain on their own. She checked again the next morning. Same thing. And the morning after that. That's when everything changed, because Sarah started keeping a log. Water levels morning and evening, cross-referenced against rainfall, temperature, and evaporation rates, she pulled from the Extension Office's own historical data. And the numbers didn't add up. Not close. Something was pulling water out of that pond faster than nature ever could on its own. She didn't know what yet. She just knew it wasn't natural, and she wasn't going to find out by staring at the surface. So she made a decision nobody in that county expected. She was going to drain it. Slowly, carefully, monitored the whole way down, because whatever was pulling that water had to be visible once the pond bottom was exposed. She had no idea she was about to expose a concealed intake line, running straight from her own spring channel to Dale Weston's bottling plant next door. And here's where it gets worse, because Dale Weston didn't need to guess whether anyone was getting suspicious. He had someone telling him directly. Nate Halloran, the county water inspector, Sarah's friend since high school, the man she'd called first when she started noticing the water levels drop, because reporting anything unusual to the inspector's office was supposed to be the responsible thing to do. What Sarah didn't know was that Nate had been quietly consulting for Weston's company on the side for the past year, a side contract worth more than his entire county salary, and that every time Sarah called him with a concern, he passed it straight to Weston's office before doing anything official about it. Nate told himself it wasn't betrayal. He told himself Weston's permit paperwork was probably fine, that Sarah was probably overreacting, and that a man in his position had to think about his own family's finances too. He had no idea, mentioning offhand to Weston's plant manager that Sarah's been logging her pond levels and might come in with a complaint soon, what he just handed over. Nobody did, not yet. And it didn't stop at the feed store. That's the part that should make your blood boil, because Dale Weston made a show of it for weeks afterward, every chance he got. At the county extension meeting the following week, he told the room, dripping with false concern, that some of our smaller operations might need a little guidance managing their water resources responsibly during a drought like this. A comment aimed squarely at Sarah, in a room full of people who knew exactly who he meant and said nothing. At his own plant's community open house that same month, he joked to a group of visiting reporters that the Voss girl next door drained her own pond dry. Guess some folks just don't understand water management. The reporters laughed along, because laughing along with Dale Weston was easier than asking the follow-up question nobody wanted to ask. Sarah stopped correcting people after that. She let them think what they wanted. She kept draining the pond, kept logging every inch, kept waiting for the bottom to finally show her what 6 weeks of missing water actually looked like. But here's what nobody knew yet, not even Sarah. 3 feet from empty, her shovel hit something that wasn't rock, wasn't root, wasn't anything natural at all. Here's where the system started working against her, exactly the way it always had. Sarah's formal water use complaint, filed with the county the same week she started draining the pond, sat untouched for 11 days, flagged, pending inspector review. The same inspector who'd been quietly on Weston's payroll for a year. Her request for an emergency well level assessment, filed right behind it, got the same treatment. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way Dale Weston had spent 18 months building it to work for him, and against the one neighbor whose water he'd been quietly siphoning the whole time. And nobody at that county office saw what was coming next, because at that point, not even Sarah fully understood what she just pulled up out of the mud with her own 2 hands. Now here's the part that's going to make you sick, because it's not Dale Weston. It's someone Sarah trusted completely. Nate came by that evening, same as always, offering to help however he could, asking how the draining was going, whether she'd found anything yet. And Sarah, exhausted, frustrated, still trusting the friend she'd known since high school, told him everything. The buried pipe, the direction it ran, her plan to report it first thing in the morning. Nate didn't hesitate long. He called Weston's plant manager that same night, the way he had every other time, except this time, what he was handing over wasn't a rumor. It was a countdown. Because Dale Weston knew exactly what that pipe was the second Nate described it. He'd had it installed himself, quietly, the same month his plant expanded, routed straight from Sarah's spring channel to his own intake system, feeding water into his bottling operation that his agricultural permit never came close to covering. And Dale Weston was not a man who was going to let one exposed pipe end everything he'd built without a fight. Sarah didn't know Weston had found out. What she knew was simpler. There was a pipe buried in the bottom of her drained pond, and she needed someone official to see it before she touched it any further. So she did what any careful landowner would do. She called the county water inspector's office first thing that morning, the same office, the same number she'd called every time before, and requested an emergency site visit to document what she'd found. The woman who answered told her someone would be out within the week. Here's what nobody told Sarah outright, though it would matter soon enough. Nate had already flagged her file internally as low priority, pending further documentation. The same phrase he'd used on every one of her complaints for the past year. Sarah wasn't just waiting on a bureaucratic delay anymore. She was being stalled on purpose. Sarah didn't wait for the county. She called a private hydrologist out of her own pocket, a woman named Priya Anand who did contract groundwater assessments across 3 counties, and asked her to come look at the pipe herself. Priya came out 2 days later, examined the intake line, ran a quick flow test, and told Sarah something that made her sit down right there at the pond's muddy edge. "Ms. Voss, I'd want lab confirmation on the exact volume, but based on pipe diameter and flow direction, this line has been diverting a significant portion of your spring's natural discharge for at least a year, maybe longer, and it's running directly toward the Weston bottling facility." For the first time in 6 weeks, Sarah felt something close to vindication. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. Because that's when Dale Weston showed up at her gate, not with an apology, but with a company attorney, and a claim that stopped Sarah cold. That the pipe was part of a legitimate agricultural drainage improvement his company had installed under an easement agreement from the previous property owner, and that Sarah tampering with company infrastructure by draining her pond could expose her to a claim for damages. "You should have called me before you went digging around down there, Sarah," Weston said, standing at the fence with his lawyer's folder in hand. "That's company property. You're the one who's created a problem here, not me." But there was something Weston didn't know yet, something about to complicate his plan far more than one determined neighbor ever could on her own. Because word travels fast in a county running dry, and reports of household wells failing across 3 neighboring properties had already reached the state's groundwater monitoring division, whose staff had been quietly tracking withdrawal anomalies in that watershed for weeks. Her name was Grace Acaffer, a groundwater compliance officer with the State Agricultural Resources Division, who'd flagged Weston's bottling plant for an unusually high water draw months earlier, without yet being able to prove where the excess was coming from. Grace called Sarah directly after Priya's report reached the state office through a routine referral. "Ms. Voss, if what you and your hydrologist have documented is accurate, this isn't just a property dispute. This could explain why 3 household wells in your watershed have failed this summer, and I need to see everything you have before Weston's people get near that pipe again." For the first time in this whole ordeal, Sarah had someone in her corner who wasn't a friend she'd have to second-guess, someone who simply recognized what she'd found and wanted to see it proven. Hope rose again, real hope this time. But 2 days before Grace was set to inspect the pipe herself, Sarah learned that Weston had scheduled a major press event at his own plant that same week, a live announcement of a planned expansion, with local news crews, county officials, and investors all invited designed, Sarah suspected, to get ahead of any bad press before Grace's investigation went public. If Weston controlled the story first, if he stood in front of cameras and framed himself as the victim of a neighbor's reckless pond draining before the state's findings ever came out, it wouldn't matter what the pipe actually proved. The narrative would already be set. And that's when Sarah learned from Nate himself, showing up unannounced, guilt written all over his face, exactly how Weston had found out about the pipe discovery so fast in the first place. "It was me, Sarah. I've been consulting for his company for over a year. Every time you called me, I passed it along. I didn't want to admit that, but you deserve to know before Friday." Sarah didn't say anything for a long moment. Every piece slid into place at once: the delayed complaints, the stalled inspection requests, Weston's lawyer showing up right when the pipe was found. None of it had been coincidence. All of it traced back to a friend she'd trusted since high school. The press event was 3 days out. 3 days, with a state investigator needing time to confirm what the pipe proved, and a plant expansion announcement about to broadcast Weston's version of events to the whole county first. Nobody knew yet how this was going to end, but everybody in that county was about to find out at once. Sarah had 3 days, and she spent the first one doing something Dale, Weston, never expected a woman with a drained pond and a stalled county complaint to have the resources to do. She let Grace Ackaffer take the lead, and Grace didn't just prepare a technical report. She pulled Weston's original agricultural use permit application from the state archive and compared it, line by line, against his facility's actual metered water usage for the past 18 months. The numbers didn't just fail to match, they weren't close. Because it turned out Weston's agricultural permit capped his groundwater draw at a fraction of what his bottling plant had actually been pulling, since the concealed pipe went in, a gap large enough, Grace's analysis showed, to account for nearly all of the anomalous drop in Sarah's pond, and a meaningful share of the well failures reported on 3 neighboring properties that same summer. Grace also did one more thing Sarah hadn't expected. She quietly requested Nate's inspection file history from the county and found a pattern of delayed, downgraded, or dismissed complaints against Weston's facility going back over a year, all logged by the same inspector. Weston's press event went ahead exactly as scheduled. A ribbon cutting for his plant expansion, local news cameras set up on the lawn, county officials in folding chairs, a podium with the company logo, and a crowd of employees and neighbors gathered to watch. He didn't know Grace Ackaffer was standing near the back with her compliance report in hand. He didn't know Sarah had brought Priya Annan's original flow assessment, printed and ready. And he didn't know that Nate, pale, quiet, standing off to the side instead of near the podium where Weston's staff usually placed him, had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding which side of this he actually wanted to be on when the cameras started rolling. Weston stepped up to the microphone mid-speech, talking about responsible growth and being good neighbors to this community, when Sarah walked up the center aisle, in full view of the cameras, and asked one question loud enough for every microphone to catch. "Would you mind explaining the pipe running from my spring channel to your intake system, Dale, since we're talking about being good neighbors?" The reporters turned their cameras toward her immediately. Weston's smile stayed fixed for a moment, frozen, the way a smile gets right before it stops being real. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. "This is a ribbon cutting, not the place for." "It's the perfect place," Grace said, stepping forward with her folder, "since you invited the cameras." She held up the flow assessment for the nearest camera to see. "This facility has been drawing groundwater at nearly 4 times the volume permitted under its agricultural use classification for at least 18 months, through an unpermitted intake line connected to a neighboring property's natural spring." The lawn went quiet, the kind of quiet that happens on live television when everyone realizes the segment just became the story. Weston's plant manager tried to step in front of a camera to redirect attention, but a reporter had already turned toward Nate instead, drawn by his visibly stricken expression. "Sir, is there something you'd like to add?" the reporter asked. Nate hesitated only a moment before pulling out his phone. "I have a recorded voicemail Mr. Weston left me 2 nights ago," he said, voice unsteady but clear, asking me to make sure Ms. Voss's complaint file stayed buried until after today. He held the phone up and played it Weston's own voice, clear and unmistakable, coming through the phone's speaker in front of every camera on that lawn. Instructions to keep the file quiet a few more days, just till the announcement's done. The reaction wasn't laughter this time. It was the sound of 40 people reaching for their own phones at once, and it wasn't aimed at Sarah anymore. Weston's confidence didn't leave his face right away. That was the worst part for him. It just sort of stayed there, frozen, while his own recorded voice kept playing behind him, and every camera on that lawn stayed locked on his reaction. He didn't get a clean exit. He stood there at his own podium, microphone still live, while his plant manager tried and failed to usher the press away, while county officials quietly stood up from their folding chairs and walked toward their cars instead of toward him, while the ribbon meant to open his expansion sat uncut on the table behind him. Nobody left to cut it with. Grace confirmed on camera, before the segment ended, that the state would be opening a formal enforcement review into the facility's water rights violations that same week. The story ran on every local station that night, and by morning, 3 separate news outlets had picked it up statewide. Sarah's pond began refilling within days once the pipe was capped, and the state ordered Weston's facility to cut its draw back to permitted levels. The neighboring wells that had gone dry that summer started recovering by early fall. Nate didn't disappear after that day on the lawn. He came around a few times that autumn, quieter, helping Sarah with things that needed doing, slowly trying to earn back something he understood he had no right to expect quickly. Weston's company settled with the state that winter, paying damages to every affected property owner, Sarah included, and losing its agricultural use permit entirely. Sarah didn't say much when a reporter called for a follow-up interview. She just looked out at her pond, filling steadily for the first time in months, and said the only thing that felt true. I didn't drain it because I didn't trust the water. I drained it because I did. It was never lying to me. Everybody around it was. That right there is why we tell these stories. If this one hit you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to The American Farmer. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you see it coming? Because I want to know. We'll see you in the next one.